Welcome back, guys. We're going to continue with the civil rights movement. This is part 3. So, after the major successes with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the 24th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we start to see some shifts in the civil rights movement. All right. We've ended Jim Crow laws, right? Now the focus shifted to addressing other inequalities, right? But this is going to be much more difficult, all right? Um, Adding to this, there are several race riots that occurred throughout the country right around this time period. The 60s, as you have gathered, right, is a very tumultuous time period, right? Lots of protesting going on from various groups. It's the Cold War, we have the Vietnam War going on, right? And adding to this, we have these race riots. We have the very famous Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1965. 35 people died, over 900 people were injured. There was over $30 million in damages. In addition, there was a big one in Detroit in 1967, which has been the site of previous race riots, and also Newark, New Jersey as well. 43 people died in the Detroit riots, 26 people died in Newark, and again, millions of dollars in damage. All right. And the causes of these inner city riots, they were all these investigations, and it was found to be these very difficult things to address: poverty, housing inequality, and police brutality. Um, it really showed that winning these legal rights, eliminating, segregation and discrimination, was not going to solve decades of racism and inequality, right? We really get to those economic issues, which are going to be much harder to address. Um, in addition to this, we also see many of the civil rights leaders and groups and organizations start to disagree over goals and strategies, and whatnot. And this really causes the movement to kind of splinter. It had been really focused and really unified, from the mid 60s from the mid 50s to the mid 60s. But around this time period, it starts to split. Malcolm X really led the charge for this. He called for African Americans to separate themselves from white society. So he was against, integration and whatnot. And he was not a proponent of nonviolence, as Martin Luther King was. Stokely Carmichael, you can see him here. He was a leader of SNCC, and he urged SNCC to stop recruiting white activists and white volunteers and really focus on developing African American pride. This is a quote here from Stokely Carmichael. He said, Dr. King's policy was that nonviolence would achieve the gains for Black people in the United States. His major assumption was that if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see you suffering and he will be moved to change his heart. That is very good. He only made one fallacious assumption. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States does not. And this is going to lead us into what we call the Black Power movement, which is basically a rejection of Martin Luther King's nonviolent methods. Black Power activists preach separatism, sometimes militant separatism, rather than integration. In 1966, the Black Panther Party was founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And their goal was to fight police brutality in Oakland, but then it grew to this much larger organization, this national organization that at times preached armed revolts. Another big influence here is the Vietnam War. The draft was seen as very discriminatory and hypocritical because it disproportionately affected poor people, and Black people were disproportionately poor in the United States. And so we see this growing Black Power movement. All right, one really famous example of that here in 1968 at the Mexico City Olympics. The two American winners you can see here, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, were expelled from the games for their protest Here they gave this Black Power salute, and they were heavily criticized back home. And this came on the heels, of course, of the assassination of Martin Luther King. He was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, at a motel in Memphis, Tennessee, by fugitive James Earl Ray. And his assassination was, of course, very shocking to the public. People were very saddened, right? And this is going to have a huge effect on the civil rights movement, because Martin Luther King had been the key leader, the face of the civil rights movement. In the wake of his assassination in 1968, Congress is going to pass the Fair Housing Act. It was meant to end discrimination in housing, but it was not well enforced and wasn't really retroactive, in that it didn't really correct any of the housing discrimination or segregation that had existed for several decades. And what we see as we get into the 1970s is African Americans really struggle to make economic progress. The economy starts to kind of stagnate. It's not growing as much as it had been. And we had talked about, white flight, and the effects of that, leaving the inner city poor and populated with mostly minorities, right, where the suburbs are mostly white, and much more wealthy and affluent, all right? And you can see how, this de facto segregation still really exists, even though we've gotten rid of discrimination and redlining and things like that. The effects of it still show, all right? In 1974, we see a Supreme Court case, Milliken v. Bradley. This limited the efforts to integrate schools. It ruled that desegregation does not require students to change school districts. I do want to talk briefly about affirmative action, because this is something we see happen here in the 60s and 70s as a way to address some of these historical inequalities. Basically, affirmative action is giving privileges or preferable treatment for certain groups like minorities, African Americans, or women, in employment or education to correct historical inequalities, right? These groups have been historically discriminated against, have not had as many opportunities. So the idea is to correct for some of that. And it was supported by presidential and congressional action in the 60s and 70s. In the Supreme Court case, Griggs v. Duke Power helped pave the way for more affirmative action programs. However, it gets a bit confusing. In 1978, we see a really famous case, Regents of the University of California v. Bakke. This ruled that preferential treatment based solely on race was not allowed, but race could be one of several factors in admitting students to university. So it can't be the only thing, like universities can't have quotas, right? Like I'm going to take X number of Black people and Y number of Asian people and, W number of women or whatever, but it can be a factor. So it continues to be a confusing issue. And what we see is civil rights still really remains a big issue today. This long history of discrimination in education, employment, and housing really contributes to persistent inequalities. If you look at data, African Americans have disproportionately higher rates of poverty, unemployment, and incarceration. If you look at this, this shows the racial wealth gap. Here, this data is from 2014, showing that the average white family or average white household worth over $100,000, while the average Black household is worth about $5,000. You can also see this when you look at prison populations, right? Black people make up about 12 or 13% of the total US population. But if you look at the incarcerated population, the number of people in prison, they make up about 40% of people in prison. So obviously that is not reflective of US society, right? Today, some of the big issues that we see, police brutality and discrimination, particularly in the criminal justice system, are among some of the big areas of focus today. All right, so that is the end of Civil Rights Movement Part 3.